start out, particularly if you're doing something like a home lab, if you're starting off small for practicing, for learning, that kind of thing, it might seem really obvious to go, okay, I'm doing this to deploy this config file, I'll just copy and paste that block into another file. That's nice, there's a low resistance to that, it's very easy, it's very quick, that kind of thing. And particularly when you're starting out, it's probably easier to do that than to go, I'm going to learn what a role structure looks like and how to create a role in Ansible. So you copy and paste. The thing is, some point down the road, you've then got how many versions of that code, they're all slightly derivative, you know, maybe you've tweaked it as you've gone along, there's now a really good version of it in your latest thing. What do? Do you then backport that into your previous playbooks if you need to run one? It brings all these challenges, these sort of problems that you're storing up, not for the time, but for later on. And so this, I've sort of written it down here, every copy is a future maintenance burden. It's like technical debt. You're building up technical debt because sooner or later you've got those outdated versions to go back to. And you really don't want to do that if you can avoid it. So again, this is the kind of thing, I've got very old project directories which I've kept because I just need a record of what I did. Haven't had the time to invest in updating them and improving the principles in which they were done, but I've done things like this where you have the original code, you then create a copy, change a variable in it, let's say, then you add a task, and it just gets into a mess very, very quickly. You can't keep track of, particularly with naming like that I've got there, how do you know which one of them is the most up-to-date version, which is the one that really works? You don't know. So, if you can avoid that, please do. It's definitely worth avoiding. And this, I've mentioned this already verbally, this is the don't repeat yourself, the dry principle. Very important that you have one single source of truth for your code, whether that's a role in Ansible, whether that's like a function or a library in another high-level language. But the whole idea is it's not just about the code or the language or whatever, it's about having this single source of truth. It's about actually understanding where it lives, what you're doing, and what you need to update in the future. If you're going to come back to this and fix something, which is the right version to run? Mistake number 3, hard-coded values everywhere. So again, and I think this applies to probably to other high-level languages as well, applies definitely to Ansible. They are easy to do, right? We know, oh, this is the IP address that I want, or this is the host name of my server. I'll just put that in the task. That's easy. Again, it's low friction. It gets you started really, really quickly. You're doing it maybe for one server, for one VM in your home lab, let's say, just hypothetically. It's really easy to get started. Then you come down the road a bit. You may be adding roles, you're adding tasks, that kind of thing. So you want to reuse it. How do you then reuse it? If you've used the same value, particularly if you've used it in like 3 or 4 places in your code, do you then have to do a search and replace on that? Do you have to think too hard about where it is? You know, is it one of those fragile pieces of code where if you don't catch every single instance of it, the code, you'll run it and something will break, then you spend time fixing it, or something unexpected happens. It seems like a low resistance way to get started until you have the pain of it when it's actually in place. So actually, what you want to do is think about what's going to change in your code going forward and where can you put variables in early on. So again, we've got an example here. Now, this isn't a terrible piece of code because we've got examples of variables up at the front, but they are hard-coded, including a port for the application and the DB host IP address. Now, we won't even talk about passwords in the clear that are in there today, but the thing is, that's great in one playbook. What if this is like let's say this is a development environment and then you want to deploy to production? We know that that port might change. That DB host IP is definitely going to change. And let's hope that the password is going to change and be stored somewhere better than in there. So does that mean you then have to take an entire copy of this playbook, so we're back to the copy and paste problem again, change those variables, rerun the playbook? it's not actually going to help you to do that. It's going to be messy, it's going to be cumbersome. How do you know what's where? So really you need to start thinking about not just using variables, but where do you store those variables as well. So for anybody who's panicking, by the way, I know I'm storing up a lot in production. That, you know, this is the thing, like, it's very easy to differentiate Ansible from, we always think of code, we're going to test code before it goes into production. That seems like a sensible thing to do. Ansible's not code, right? It's an operations thing, it deploys stuff, it's not actually code. The thing is, Ansible kind of is code, and if you get it wrong, it's going to do something bad. You really want an ability to test it. And there are some ways you can test it without necessarily having to have a complete dev set up, a complete dev replica. Well, again, we'll touch on them coming up. But the point is, Ansible is code. It is making changes to a system, to a switch, a host, a server, that kind of thing. You really don't want it running untested if you can avoid it. And the final one, before we get into the solutions for these, ignoring error handling. Now this is one is a little bit more subtle. This is more subtle than the idempotency piece. So, again, if you're running this for yourself like a home lab setup, maybe you don't need to think about this so hard, because it's like, okay, this is my server, if I break it, I'll withstand the downtime, I'll fix it. In a work environment, in something where other people are depending on it, it's a little bit of a different story. So what we've got here is we've got a very simple example over on the left. I've given them silly names that kind of give you an idea of where the logic in this flow is going to go wrong. Because the whole idea is actually these commands, Ansible will handle errors gracefully, so it'll hit an error, and its default behavior is it won't run any more tasks on that host, it'll just stop. It'll continue on other hosts if there are ones in the inventory, but it stops dead on that host. That prevents it causing any more damage because something went wrong. You can override that behavior, but it's actually a very sensible default. That's great, except in an example like this, where what we're doing is we are downloading a tarball, we're stopping an app with the idea that we'll deploy it and then we'll restart the app. The problem with that is, let's say that that download is corrupt. Let's say the file doesn't come down completely, or the tarball was never good to begin with, something like that. By the time you get to the end of that task there, you've already stopped the app. So end users have no app to connect to. Play stops executing there because it hit an error. The app never restarts, even if the code was never deployed. So it's left in a broken state. So this is where you need to start thinking about error handling. So, okay, if you get to that stage, and like that, fails because the archive's corrupted, how does it recover from that? Does it prompt the user? Can it actually take some remedial action? You know, ideally what you'd have up here, I think, if I were thinking about this myself, what would I do? I'd have a backup task. We'd back the web app up before we tried to run Tara over the top of it. We'd have some sort of exception handling, which Ansible has built in. So if the extract fails, like it does in this example, then you restore the backup and restart the web server. So you actually attempt some sort of automated recovery rather than leaving it in a broken state. So although Ansible is very graceful at handling errors, you can help it along because it will leave things broken if it falls over halfway through. So just have a think about that flow and what would happen if it tripped over somewhere. So, keeping myself on time because I've got one eye on the clock, addressing the mistakes. We've talked a lot about what not to do in Ansible. What do you do instead? First of all, the directory structure. So this directory structure here that's on the slide, there's a few permutations of this around. The main thing I would say is that's the official link there to the documentation which advises you on where to go look for the directory structures. Even that proposes a couple of permutations, but they're all in that kind of style. If you adopt that kind of style, you'll be using the sort of Ansible play directory structure that most people in the community use. So it'll make sense to you down the road, it'll make sense to another person who picks your code up and takes a look at it. It basically is going to make sense, and it gives you some really sensible defaults. So for example, your roles by default go in the roles directory, self-explanatory. Your inventories go in an inventory directory. You've got variables in directories with variables. You can even name variable directories when you get more advanced after hosts in your inventory to contain specific host variables. Now, don't worry if you don't know what that is yet, it doesn't matter. The point is, if you adopt a directory structure like this from virtually day one, it's going to make sense to you 6 months down the road, and it'll make sense to anyone else who picks your code up, particularly if you're working in a team or a collaborative environment. We've talked a lot about roles, about not reusing code, about not repeating yourself, about not creating giant monolithic plays. When do you create a role? I put us on a rule of thumb here. This is, like so many things, this is opinionated. This is not necessarily a rule. If you break this, you're committing the cardinal sin. But I think if you have a single phrase that describes what it can do, installs Docker is an example that I put on the slide, or configures SSL, those are generally multi-step actions. How to memorize what a role looks like. If you just know that one command, keep that in your note keeper, then you're away. So for reference, this is what a role does look like, and this is the kind of thing, it won't create the specific templates, but if you run that role in its subcommand, it'll create something like this for you. So basically, as I say, it's very simple. You can have a README in it, you should really, because that way you'll remember and know how to operate the role. But what you have here, I'll come this side of the slide so we can see. The role name is actually the directory name of the role. It's no more complicated than that. Default variables go in defaults. Variables at a higher order of precedence, we'll come to that in a minute, go in vars. Tasks, so the actual things that Ansible is executing on the host go in tasks. Handlers we'll come to in a minute. Templates are great, you'll use them. Files, fast to deploy. Metadata, we don't need to worry about that, probably we're in the beginner space. But basically, this is what a role looks like. And the great thing is, let's say that you write a role, it doesn't need handlers. You can leave that directory out. It won't throw an error. It doesn't care if the directory isn't there, it just assumes it doesn't need it. So Ansible is really forgiving in that way. You don't actually need to be too pedantic, maybe too precise. Now, variable hierarchy. This one, again, you're not going to remember this from the word go, and don't worry about that. There is, again, there's a link here, so anybody, and it, by the way, I'll just say, I know we're sharing recordings and things as well. If anybody wants the slide deck, just, again, contact me afterwards, I'll send it to you. That's not a problem, you can get the links that way. This, again, is all well documented, so refer to the docs, but I put on here the order of variable precedence. This, again, doesn't matter too much on day one, but it will matter coming up further down the road, and it'll actually begin to get quite valuable to know that you can override a variable. So rather than leaving it blank and forcing someone to set it, you can set a safe default, and that's quite a valuable thing to do. And then the bottom one there, the -e on the command line, you can always override a variable because that takes precedence at the top level. So that one's well worth knowing. Group and host variables. So here's an interesting one. I mentioned hard coding variables earlier, and we had an example of code that had a DB IP address and a port number and that kind of thing in it. Let's say that was a development environment, and like I say, you don't want to recreate the code for a production environment. You know, an entire copy just with changing those values. How do you do that? Well, what you can do is you can actually have different hosts in your inventory. That's an important part of how Ansible works. It has an inventory. And then you could, again, you choose how your inventory looks. You could have groups called production. You could have groups called development, that kind of thing. And then in those individual files, so these individual files actually contain the same variable names, but with different definitions, with different values set. So I've called them all web servers, but let's say that was dev and that was prod. In that one you put the IP address of the database for development, in that one you put the IP for production. And when it runs through the inventory, again, Ansible, this beautiful simplicity, it's going through known directory names, so it knows to look in a directory called group vars for variables that apply to inventory groups, kind of self-explanatory. That matches the group name and it looks at the variable value. It's perhaps not the best explanation I've ever given on group variables and host variables, but it's well worth learning. It will serve you well in the future, I promise you that. Now, Ansible Vault. Very specifically, Ansible Vault is distinct from any other Vault product on the market, because I know the name gets reused by other vendors and things as well. This one is worth knowing about because if you start out like I did with that example code, you might have a password in your code, which you really don't want to do. And you certainly don't want to end up pushing that either deliberately or accidentally to a public Git repository. That's just not a good idea, as we all know. So Ansible Vault, again, it ships with Ansible. It's a command, just like you have Ansible-playbook, Ansible-galaxy, you have Ansible-vault. It creates and manages for you encrypted files. So I think they're AES-256 at the moment. And these files, they YAML when you edit them in their unencrypted format. So you write them just like you write a normal file with variables. So you list all your variables in, you close it, and then it's encrypted at rest. When you run the playbook command, you don't have to decrypt it, so you don't ever have to have the file decrypted on your file system. Ansible, you tell it to prompt you for the vault password, you give it the password, it will decrypt the file as it runs, decrypts it in memory, I believe is how it works, and then it has access to the variables, but the file on disk stays encrypted, so that way you're never leaving your passwords in the clear. And one thing I would say, Vault files are YAML files just like any other file. You probably want to put YAML on the end of it to remind you that it's a vars file or something like that. It won't look like a vars file when you do a directory listing. Sorry, not a vars file, a Vault file. So you might want to put Vault in the file name just so that you know what it is, because otherwise you might open it in an editor and it looks like it's garbled.
I'm sorry, just a quick interruption.
Yeah.
If something is opened in Vault, does that stay out of the logs as well? Like is that redacted in the logs that
Okay, that's a good question. I didn't include that in the presentation. It's not by default, but you can tell it to redact that in the logs. No problem. Okay, tags for selective execution. Now, I'm probably going to need to speed up a little bit to keep myself on time, so apologies if I talk a little bit faster. This is basically, you, by default, you'll write a playbook and it runs beginning to end in the order that you wrote it. And that's great deterministic behavior. It's what we want Ansible for. If you end up commenting blocks of it out because you need to run only a subset of it, I mean, I've done it. Again, it's a thing I've done. But actually, you don't need to do that. And of course, then, what are you going to do? You're going to commit that commented out version to source control. How do you manage that? The better way to do that is to put tags onto each task. You can then choose either to run only specific tags, you can choose to skip over specific tags. Basically, tags are your friend for when you, let's say you've written something that takes, because a playbook can take 20 minutes to run, particularly if it's downloading packages and that kind of thing. If you have a task fail near the end, you're not going to want to rerun it from the beginning because it's going to take too long. So how do you get it to just run the latter part again? Tags are the answer to that. So they're well worth doing. Again, they're just a very simple stanza. Multiple tags can go on one task. Very easy to make friends with and well worth using.
Is it worth to tag your rows? So if you have bigger playbook with multiple rows, I usually tag each row so then I can run on a specific playbook file.
Yes, I would say yes, that's worth doing. Yeah, absolutely.
You can do that from within the playbook, so you don't need to put the tag on every task.
Yes, in the playbook.
Yeah, do the same.
Cool. Okay, handlers. Handlers are another great one. So, what is a handler? Let's say that you run this code. This is perfectly valid Ansible play. These tasks run sequentially, so we will deploy an Nginx config, deploy some SSL certs, and restart Nginx. That's great. That all works. What happens if these are already deployed? So somebody runs this a second time, and these two take no action. It still restarts the web server at the end. It's not the end of the world, but if you've got users who are connected to it, it's disruptive. It's also wasting CPU cycles, it's wasting time that you don't need. A handler looks a little like this. So in a role, it goes in the handlers directory. I promised you we'd get to that later. And basically a handler in Ansible land it's something that is only fired when it's notified. So these notified clauses at the end of these tasks, these will only notify the handler called restart Nginx if this task results in a change. If it results in an OK, which means no change was made, the handler doesn't get called at all, and so the service never gets restarted. The other thing is, you'll notice we've got two notifiers here. So if both these change, it might notify twice. The great thing about the handler is, Ansible's intelligent, it runs it once and once only at the end of the play run, so it doesn't restart it twice. So really efficient as well. Now I mentioned debugging, there's check mode. I'm going to need to skip forward a little bit, but you've got two modes in Ansible that don't make any changes to the server. So if you don't actually have a complete dev setup and you need to run something and see what the code would do, or at least get an idea, you've got check mode, which is basically a simulation. It can't simulate everything is the only thing I'd say. There are certain modules like shell and command where it won't simulate what they do because it can't. It can't know every possible command you could throw at it. But check mode is well worth running. And diff mode, I only discovered that it had this recently. I don't know if anybody else was aware, but it can actually, this is like check mode, but it shows you the differences it's going to make. But there's an important point that I learned, particularly when I played with this for the first time. It's not like check mode in that it doesn't do a dry run by default. It makes changes, but it shows you the diff as it makes the changes. So you have to combine it with minus check. But what this does is, like this, you can see it will actually show you what changes it's going to make to a text file. So really, really powerful tool for seeing what's going to happen as opposed to just crossing your fingers. Then Ansible Galaxy. Ansible Galaxy, if you haven't visited it already, it's a huge repository of roles and now collections. You know, if you can think of something that you might need to automate with Ansible, let's say install a Postgres database server. Somebody's already solved that problem. Somebody's already written a role for that. They're all hosted on Ansible Galaxy. They're all linked back to GitHub, so they're all open source, so you can review the source code before you just run it. You know, you don't want to be running someone else's code without necessarily reviewing it in a production environment. But it's a huge resource. It's like Docker Hub, PyPy, depending on what repository you prefer. Definitely have a look there if you want to look, A, for a solution that will work out of the box, or B, for ideas. You know, maybe you can choose someone else's design patterns to learn from. It's also a great resource for that. Couple more minor things. Name your tasks meaningfully. You can actually create tasks in Ansible without the name at all. That will work. Again, I've done that as a quick and dirty workaround. Honestly, you'll regret it if you do that. Maybe not today, but again, down the road, because what's it doing? Also, when the play runs, it prints out the names as the head for each task as it runs. So actually, if you're watching the playbook run, you can see what it's doing. If you can use native modules where possible, you should do so, basically. So you have modules like shell, command, and raw that run basically commands on the server without the need for any complex modules. They're not idempotent. They are really catch-alls for those cases where there doesn't exist a good module today. Use fully qualified collection names. I have not done that in this presentation. I openly admit that. They came in with the advent of collections. Basically, they mean when you use a module in a playbook, they have like a dot notation in them is how you can recognize them. And they prevent any possible future clash if anybody ever comes up with a module that has the same name as an existing one. So they're just being very explicit. Ansible still works today. I'm just going to skip to the end and I'll come to your question if that's okay. But there's something that I think are a best practice that you should use. And Ansible Lint, I have found that very valuable for just helping me look at my code, making sure it'll pick out silly things like I got the indentation level wrong on that clause. It integrates with VS Code or your preferred editor as well, so it's really, really neat. Helps you find errors quickly, helps you keep your coding style compliant, simple, easy to read. And then finally, if you are using things like roles and collections, it's worth pinning your versions just as you would in any other language. Otherwise, there's nothing to stop an author on Ansible Galaxy pushing, the next major release that completely changes how it works. That then breaks your playbook. So you always want to pin versions if you're using other people's collections or roles. Very quickly into next steps. So how would I get started? If you've written something today that repeats the things that I said not to do, don't just set out to completely rewrite it. If you want to, you can, but I always think don't boil the ocean. Make changes a bit at a time, step through it, set up a development environment, play with things, learn how to do things. Create a role is a good way to start. If you need to automate something, create a role for that, add some default variables, try out some of the things that are in this presentation, and just build up. As I say, if you try and just completely rewrite something you've written from scratch, you're going to probably open yourself up to a little bit more stress. And like everything that I think is here at Config Management Camp, you're not alone. There is a huge community behind this. The Ansible forum is a great place to go and get help. The Ansible docs are really, really good. I rely on them a lot. There is a chat on Matrix you can go to talk to people. And shameless plug for one of the books that I've written on there as well. So there's any number, obviously there's loads of books out there on Ansible. In short, there are no shortage of learning resources. So, keeping us just about to time, any questions? Yes?
One advice to new people, read up on include versus import. Because
I like that.
Tags,
yeah,
that's a big thing.
No, I like that. That's a good one.
Subtle differences.
Yeah.
Just Google it.
Yeah, that's worth. I should go into a future revision of this presentation. I like that. Thank you. Who else did we have? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you why you use twice the notify command for the handler in the example.
Once on each task.
Yes.
So, I suppose that's a simple example, but let's say that you renew the SSL certificate in that example. So you don't change the file names for the certificate and the key. So the config file doesn't change, but the key and the certificate file do. They get redeployed. You would want to notify the handler to restart because you changed the cert and the private key, but you didn't change the config. Equally, you could change the config file, but not change the TLS configuration.
So either one or another would trigger the handler.
That's right, but whether it gets one trigger or two, it only fires once. So it gives you that sort of and/or function. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else? Or I think we're there. Gives me. Oh yes, sorry. Yes, I did promise I'd come back to you.
One question regarding teamwork. When different people are working together on the same code base, do you have any best practices how to handle them? When it comes to, for example, tech teams.
Not off the top of my head, I must admit, no. It's something that might be a good one to come back to tomorrow if you want to catch up with me offline. Not to duck the question, but I need to also run up to my next presentation on the third floor. But please come find me if you want to chat. And the same goes to anyone else in this room. If you want to ask anything else or have a chat, come find me, I'll be around. Thank you.